The skeleton that rewrote history. It began not with a discovery in some ancient tomb or royal crypt, but beneath a car park in the city of Hull. When construction workers broke ground to build a new magistrate's court, they did not expect to disturb the dead. But they did. More than 240 of them. Men, women, and children. Each one buried within the walls of a medieval friary. Each one carrying secrets that time had not erased. Among them lay a single man, aged perhaps 30, buried in a coffin that had survived 6 centuries underground. His bones would upend half a millennium of accepted history. Because what they carried was not faith, not relic, not sin, but disease. This man, now known only by his excavation number, 1216, would challenge one of medicine's oldest myths, that syphilis came to Europe from the New World, brought home by Christopher Columbus and his sailors. But Skeleton 1216 died long before Columbus ever set sail. Archaeologists called it the magistrate's court site. At first, it was routine work, record, map, catalog, but soon the bones began to speak. They told a story of infection and decay, of a disease that carved its signature into bone, leaving behind lesions, pits, and deformations. The lead archaeologist, John Buglass, described it simply. The preservation was extraordinary. Some still had shoes. In one of those coffins, the telltale signs were clear. The skull, pockmarked like the surface of the moon. The roof of the mouth, gone, eaten away by rot. The leg bones, thickened and warped, shaped into grotesque blades by endless inflammation. These were not random injuries. They were the unmistakable marks of venereal syphilis. Syphilis is a storyteller of suffering. Unlike most diseases that vanish without trace, this one inscribes itself into the skeleton, a cruel medical graffiti that survives centuries. At the University of Bradford, specialists in paleopathology examined Skeleton 1216 under the cold lights of their lab. The verdict was clear. He was infected, advanced, terminal. The disease had hollowed him from the inside out. Bone tried to defend itself, to grow, to heal. But in doing so, it only betrayed the scale of its agony. These lesions had formed slowly, in the final years of a life spent in pain. When flesh was gone, the bone told what the man could not, that he had lived and died with syphilis. The discovery was scandalous for historians. For 500 years, school books had told the same tale, that Columbus brought syphilis back to Europe from the Americas, infecting his sailors with a New World plague that swept through the Old World like divine punishment. But this graveyard in Hull, dated to the 1300s, stood centuries before that voyage. If the dates held true, syphilis was already thriving in medieval England 150 years before Columbus ever saw land. And that meant the story of this disease and the guilt of a continent would have to be rewritten from the bones up. But who was this man? And why had he, and dozens like him, been buried within the sacred walls of a monastery? The archaeologists traced the site to an Augustinian friary, one of the first in England, and among the last to be destroyed in Henry VIII's dissolution. A place of prayer, healing, and charity. A place where the poor were cared for, and the wealthy paid handsomely for eternal salvation. And yet within those holy grounds, disease festered. A sexually transmitted infection among men sworn to celibacy. Something had gone very wrong. Some scholars suspected corruption, others suggested hypocrisy, but perhaps the truth was simpler. The friary was not a closed convent, but a hub of urban life. Wedged between merchant homes, taverns, and the busy docks, the friars lived at the heart of a trading port flooded with sailors, wine, and temptation. Archaeologists found hundreds of imported wine jugs, flagellation rods used for penance, and documents revealing how masses were sold for money, souls redeemed for a fee. The brothers had become businessmen of salvation, and in their midst, syphilis thrived. But was it divine punishment, or something older, buried deep in human history? The answer would come not from Scripture, but from the wood of their coffins. When scientists dated the timber, they made a discovery that silenced even the skeptics. The trees had been felled between 1340 and 1360, 1.5 centuries before Columbus's voyage. And when radiocarbon tests on skeleton 1216 returned the same range, 1300 to 1420, the implications were inescapable. This man had died of syphilis before anyone in Europe had even heard of the New World. History's narrative had just fractured. If you want stories that challenge what you thought you knew, the ones that dig under the skin of history, subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we unearth how a single disease rewired civilization itself. With the evidence undeniable, the question changed. If Columbus didn't bring syphilis to Europe, where had it really come from? And why had it appeared suddenly and violently in the hearts of cities and the bodies of men who thought themselves safe behind monastery walls? The answer, scientists soon realized, lay not in blame, but in evolution. The disease that shouldn't exist. When word spread of the Hull skeletons, it sent tremors through the historical world. Because if syphilis had existed here, in England, a century before Columbus, then everything historians believed about its origin was wrong. The Columbian theory had been simple, satisfying, and moral. Europe brings plague to America. America, in return, sends syphilis back, a perfect symmetry of punishment. But the bones told another story. Skeleton 1216, buried under a medieval friary, could not be ignored. The wood from his coffin, dated. The radiocarbon in his bones, tested. The lesions on his skull, unmistakable. It was not rumor. It was evidence. At the University of Bradford, the paleopathologist Charlotte Roberts stood by her microscope, steady and certain. The skull was pocked and eroded, what doctors call caries sicca, a textbook hallmark of late-stage syphilis. She ran her hand along the warped surface of the thigh bone, the ridges of new bone growth like melted wax. The disease had eaten him alive, and his bones had tried, in vain, to fight back. There was no mistaking it. This was venereal syphilis, the sexually transmitted form. But that posed a question more uncomfortable than any moral sermon could contain. How did a celibate brother in a Christian friary contract a disease of the flesh? The answer might have been simpler than sin. The friary was no isolated cloister. It stood in the heart of Hull's commercial chaos. Ships from Spain brought wine. Timber arrived from the Baltic. Coins, cloth, and rumor flowed through its gates. Trade brought wealth. Wealth brought people. And people brought disease. The Augustinian brothers were healers. They tended to the sick, rich or poor, and likely to the infected. In a time before gloves, before knowledge of contagion, touch alone could be deadly. A wound dressed here, a prayer whispered over there. A ritual washing shared by many. One infected patient was all it took for a disease to seed itself in sanctity. But the Hull skeletons were not alone. 2 more friary burials showed identical scars. Over 60% of the others carried subtle traces, the early signs of the same infection. That was a pattern impossible to ignore. So if not from Columbus, where did this disease come from? The historians looked west, the scientists deeper in time. Because bones don't lie, but they also don't speak without context. To rewrite 5 centuries of medical history, Charlotte Roberts needed something stronger than diagnosis. She needed proof beyond conjecture. A date. In Sheffield, scientists examined the coffin timbers. The method was dendrochronology, reading time through tree rings. Each ring a record of summer rain. Winter frost, a fingerprint of years long gone. When they matched the pattern to a master record, the numbers spoke. 1340, 1345, 1360, all of it long before Columbus's ships had touched the horizon. When the same conclusion came from radiocarbon tests on Skeleton 1216 himself, the verdict was final. He died between 1300 and 1420. The disease was already here. The timeline of infection had just been pushed back more than a century. When Roberts presented her findings in Texas to a hall of skeptical experts, many were ready to dismiss her. The world's leading American paleopathologist, George Armelagos, had built a career defending the Columbian theory. He believed syphilis had been proven pre-Columbian only in the Americas. But when he saw the photographs, the skull, the palate, the bone, he paused, then nodded. "This," he said, "is classic." The room went quiet. For the first time in 500 years, the evidence had spoken louder than tradition. But one case was not enough to overturn an empire of certainty. The debate demanded more. More skeletons, more lesions, more proof that this infection was not a strange anomaly from Hull, but part of something older and global. And so the search began, across continents and centuries, for the true origin of the world's most infamous disease. What scientists found next would move the story far beyond medieval England. It would lead them into the graves of ancient Greeks, the ruins of Pompeii, and the jungles of the pre-Columbian Americas. The truth, when it came, would destroy the simple morality tale that Europe had written for itself. Syphilis, it turned out, had always been ours. The plague that changed its shape. After Hull, the question spread faster than the infection itself. If syphilis didn't begin in the New World, how far back did it really go? To find out, scientists began unearthing the oldest bones they could find. Roman, Greek, even Bronze Age. And the further they dug, the more the disease refused to stay in one place or one time. The deeper truth was emerging. Syphilis was not born of an age. It evolved with us. For centuries, scholars had clung to a moral story. The 15th century chroniclers saw syphilis as divine vengeance, a punishment for lust, a scar of sin etched into the flesh. But bones care nothing for morality. They preserve only the physics of decay. Every lesion, every pitted groove, was a record of the bacteria's long war against the human body. And when scientists began comparing those scars across continents, they saw something astonishing. The same disease, but in different forms. Milder here, deadlier there. It seemed syphilis was not a single sickness, but a shapeshifter. In America, anthropologists uncovered thousands of skeletons predating Columbus by centuries. The lesions were familiar, but the disease seemed weaker, its victims younger. Among indigenous communities, the infection rarely turned sexual. It passed instead through childhood contact, through shared bowls, beds, and skin. Painful, yes, but not fatal, not shameful. It lived in the open. And because everyone caught it early, everyone was immune. That immunity, ironically, was what protected them from the nightmare that would later come from Europe. In contrast, the Old World was changing fast. Cities were growing. People dressed in layers. Hygiene improved just enough to separate skin from skin. The bacteria lost its easy routes of contact and evolved to survive. It retreated inward, to the warm, hidden places of the body. It learned to travel through sex. It adapted to secrecy. The plague that once spread openly became the one that dared not speak its name. Charlotte Roberts and her colleagues knew this mutation explained everything. The bacteria, Treponema pallidum, wasn't new. It had simply changed costume, reacting to the habits of the people who carried it. In hot, rural societies, it spread like a rash among children, a mild nuisance. In cold, urban civilizations, it became venereal, deadly, disfiguring, and moralized. Every society created its own version of the disease through its own way of living. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, George Armelagos and his team in the United States still clung to the Columbian idea. He'd found hundreds of pre-Columbian skeletons in America with lesions like those from Hull. To him, that proved the New World origin. To Charlotte, it proved only one thing, that the disease was universal. At an international conference, they faced each other across the table. Science versus tradition. Evidence versus expectation. Armelagos examined the British photographs, tracing the bone lesions with a finger. At last, he admitted, "This looks convincing." But he wasn't ready to surrender. "Find more," he said. "Prove it's not an accident." The demand was fair. Science needed replication. But bones don't wait to be found. They rot, fragment, disappear into mud. Then, from southern Italy, came an answer. Archaeologists excavating the ancient Greek colony of Metaponto unearthed hundreds of skeletons dating back to 600 BC. Among them, unmistakable lesions, the same saber shins, the same pitted skulls. And in the tiny jaw of a child, the clinching proof, teeth scarred by congenital syphilis. The child had been born infected. The mother, long dead, had passed the disease through her blood. The date, 2,000 years before Hull, 2,000 years before Columbus. Soon after, more evidence surfaced from Pompeii. Ancient Romans, entombed by ash, their bones showing the same signs. Latin texts described ulcers of the flesh, rotting of the nose, and madness of the brain. The disease had haunted civilization since antiquity, but no one had named it. No one had recognized its shifting face. Until now. The revelation broke the narrative completely. The Columbian exchange, that neat story of guilt and vengeance, was a myth born of arrogance. Syphilis had no single birthplace. It had followed humanity since the dawn of civilization, changing form as we changed ours. It wasn't their disease. It was ours. The bacteria's revenge. By the time the last friar was buried at Hull, the story of syphilis was already written in their bones. A disease of lust, they said. A punishment from God. But the truth was colder. It was survival. The bacterium Treponema pallidum had no morality. It adapted. Where skin contact was common, it stayed mild. Where cleanliness grew and flesh was hidden under cloth, it turned inward, becoming sexual, a parasite redesigned by civilization itself. The more refined we became, the darker it grew. When Columbus sailed west, Europe already carried the infection in silence. And when his men returned, they didn't bring it home. They spread what they already had to people who had lost their natural immunity. The irony was perfect. The old world had accused the new of corruption, but it was Europe that had sent death across the sea. Modern research confirms what the bones foretold. Syphilis did not come from one place. It followed trade routes, ports, and empire, mutating with the rise of every new city. Each age created its own form of the same ancient enemy. The Hull friars, the Roman merchants, the Greek settlers of Metaponto, all victims of the same quiet evolution. The disease never needed a conqueror. It traveled with us, changing only as fast as we did. 500 years of blame end here. Syphilis was not America's curse, nor Europe's shame, but humanity's reflection. A reminder that every civilization, no matter how holy or advanced, carries within it the seeds of its own decay. If you want more untold truths buried beneath centuries of myth, subscribe and stay with us. History isn't what we were taught. It's what we've yet to uncover.